to you. Sandra Van Obstel is Chicago-born, a second-generation Latina and leading practitioner of multi-ethnic worship. She's a preacher, a trainer, a liturgist, an activist. She's passionate about creating atmospheres that mobilize for reconciliation and justice. She has led worship for the Urbana Student Missions Conference, Willow Creek Association, InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, and others. Sandra regularly consults as both a worship leader and a mission trainer. She and her husband, Carl, minister at Grace and Peace Community in Chicago, and she's the author of 2 books, The Mission of Worship, and her most recent book, The Next Worship. So Sandra, I'll turn it over to you, and we look forward to what you have to teach us today, and then I'll be back with some more questions pretty soon. So thanks.
Fantastic. Well, I'm excited to be joined by Diane and those of you that are on the webinar today. I thought that I would start our session today by sharing some story, just a recent story. We're in the middle of a summer program at Grace and Peace Community. And so our church, which is located on the west side of Chicago, has about 85 kids from the community, 25 youth that work with the children. And then we also are joined with InterVarsity students and students from local Christian colleges that come and join our kind of later high school and early college students. So we have a lot of different cultures that are represented in our summer program at the community center. And one of the things that I love to do every year is actually work with the students and facilitated training for them that helps them understand how to create an environment where all these different cultures can coexist. So I'll share with you a little bit about the different cultures and then share a story and then link it to our topic today about being in a diverse world and what that means as ministers of the gospel, what that means as worship pastors and worship leaders, what that means as musicians. But so we're doing training, and most of the children that are in the program, many of them, if not a majority, well, definitely a majority, but not all of them, come from families that are of Mexican descent. So their families, their parents are the first to move to this country. They may even have moved here when they were little, and they might be 1.5 generation. So they're of Mexican and Central American descent. They're bilingual, and they're navigating this through culture typically. The youth that work in our program primarily come from the networks that our church has, and the church has primarily been historically Puerto Rican. And so we have a mixture, but by and large, the majority of the youth that work in the program are coming from a Puerto Rican second and third generation experience, which those of you that don't have a lot of contact or familiarity with Latino culture, it's extremely different than a Puerto Rican experience. A second, third generation is very different than first or 1.5 generation Mexican. And then the InterVarsity students come from all over, and they could be coming from small rural towns that are primarily white. They could be coming from historically Black colleges. And so they're coming in all their cultural context. So we do a game, and at the end of the game, I facilitate a discussion with them about what does it look like to create new community. And in this game, what happens is that you're playing cards, but as you move from table to table, it's a tournament. As you move from table to table because you're winning or losing, you notice that when you get to the new table, there's a different set of rules at that table. So you're operating out of your own set of rules from your own table, from your own place of origin, and you're trying to play a game at a new table with a new set of rules that were created by a different set of people. And the kind of hitch of the game is that you can't talk. So you have to try to figure out how to play this game, and you get frustrated and you get confused, and some people get a little hostile. You know, they're trying to explain to the other person that, no, this is what happens. This is the highest card. And the other person's arguing with them, no, this is the lowest card. So after playing that for, almost an hour, we get the students together and we talk about how that happens in real life, that we operate in those kinds of spaces in real life where we come from a place of maybe a family of origin, a particular denomination, a cultural group, even within the regions of our own country or within Canada. I know it's very different to be from Vancouver than it is to be from Toronto. And so you're coming with your own set of experiences, your own understanding of the rules, your own values. And then oftentimes we're not talking about what those are. We may not even be aware of what those are. And we come into confusion and frustration and isolation. And it was nobody's intent to create that. But it was nobody's intent to create that, but because of the nature of us just being different, we come into these experiences where we come to a table and we realize the rules are different and we don't know how to function. It was a great discussion. The students had a great time. They talked a lot about food. I don't know why. Maybe everybody was hungry at the time. But after this entire discussion about talking about cultural differences, it was very interesting that one of the students said, oh, yeah, this happens all the time. Like, with the summer program students, those of us that are living down the street all together, we just had a huge discussion in our home the other day about like, what's the proper way to eat grits, And so there are a lot of African-American students that are living in that home, and they were talking about what's the proper way to eat grits. And so he shared the story with us. Well, I know because the other workers there, many of them don't come from an African-American background or the South. They don't really, maybe they haven't eaten a grit. Maybe they haven't seen a grit. Maybe they don't really know the reference. And so I didn't want to tell the student, could you make something more, I didn't want to, there was nothing to correct. They were just sharing their experience. So, but I realized that some of the students in the group were looking like, I'm not connecting with your story. I'm not connecting with your example. And so I said, oh yeah, it's kind of like this. And I shared a story about rice porridge, which in Latin American culture, we have a form of rice porridge, and in Asian culture, there's a form of rice porridge. And so I shared the example, and then the students were like, oh, okay. So even just recently in the last, couple weeks, I encounter experiences that show me that there's so much about our culture and the way that we do things that we think are normal. And when we cross cultures, because we live in a diverse world, when we're interacting with people from other cultures, if we're not aware of our own culture, we can oftentimes create frustration, alienation, and dissonance between the two cultures. And this happens all the time in worship. It happens all the time. But I bring up the example about the students because really, when we talk about diverse worship in a changing world, or when we talk about the future of worship in a diverse world, we're really talking about what does it mean for us as communities, as the body of Christ, as local expressions of the church. What does it look like for us to create environments where people can come from every different culture, background, class, and come and participate at the table with the church, and be included in the worship. And so we oftentimes want that to happen, but we don't know the starting point. And the starting point I want to propose is that you have to know, we have to all understand that community, and therefore worship and worshiping communities, each have a culture. And we need to identify what the values in that culture are and how to describe that culture so we know how to link to other communities. So oftentimes it's hard to learn. So also it's been interesting with these students that are here visiting with us for the summer. They congregate with us on Sunday mornings. And Grace and Peace is a CRC church, but it is on the west side of Chicago, and it is primarily Puerto Rican, African American, and Mexican. And because of the cultural and ethnic expressions and just way of of being and preaching and talking and communicating and greeting, it doesn't feel maybe like the churches they grew up in. So it's interesting because they'll come on Sunday morning and we start prayer at 9:30. So our service starts at 10, but we have a prayer time at 9:30. And when you walk in at 9:30, there is a community of people that is, everyone is praying at the same time, and the volume is very loud, and it's kind of like extemporaneous intercession for typically our community, our city, and the world. And so they might come in and be experience that, feel that, and go, okay, this is maybe different. They may acknowledge like, okay, this is a community of people where, like in my church, we don't pray for a half an hour before the service starts. So this is a church where praying is important. Then they go into the service and they realize that there's prayer in the middle of the service. And then at the end of the service, there's like sometimes 20 minutes to, this week there was 45 minutes of prayer ministry for families, for couples, for children, for people that felt a vocational call to something. And so even though the service ends typically at 12 o'clock, we ended like more closer to 12:45. So these students are actually coming in and they're the best people to tell us what the culture of our church is like, because we're so used to it. It's normal to us. So they're the ones that can come in and say, you guys, like, you pray a lot, did you notice that, you pray in the beginning and then there's prayer in the middle and there's prayer at the end. So one of the students said, oh, this is like a church that really cares about prayer. And on the way home, and communal prayer. So on the way home, I told my husband, I said, actually, if I think about it, there was more time devoted to intercession, listening, and declarative kind of praise and prayer than there was to the actual preaching of the word or musical worship. That's very interesting. Like, I hadn't thought about that in a while, but because somebody else from the outside pointed it out to me, I was able to reflect on the culture of the church. So those are two recent examples that have happened that I just want to reflect on, even as I'm thinking about being as a local pastor, as people come into our church, that when you're in a church body, when you're in a local congregation, you oftentimes think that your worship is normal. Like, this is just worship. This is what people do every Sunday. This is how it's done. This is how we do community. But in reality, your expressions of worship and our traditions of worship are both theologically and culturally located. So as much as we want to believe that each denomination, its primary thing is its theological location, it also has just as strongly a cultural imprint. So you could look at any denomination and look at the country of origin or the region of origin, follow its practices and kind of its flavor and expression, and it will be very clear that it isn't coming from a particular country. So when you think about, for example, Reformed traditions, or even the CRC, the Christian Reformed Church, that comes from Dutch heritage, there's nothing about the expression, not the theology, but the expression, the form of church, the order of service, that says to me it originated in Latin America. Nothing. It's very clear it's European origination by its form, expression, and even language, because we know there are hymns that were written in original languages and translated. And so you could probably do this for every denomination. And obviously, when we think about things like the Egyptian Orthodox Church, we know it's an Orthodox church that comes from Egypt. And it's not only theologically distinct, it is actually culturally distinct. So I think we must understand, and we must be aware, and we must uncover that our traditions of worship are located and encased in an expression that is cultural in many ways, not only ethnically or nationally in the sense of like nation of origin, but also socioeconomically. So those are some things I wanted to start with. I wanted to say that, and that creates tension when we don't know what they are. When we don't know what the differences are, it creates tension. So the number one question I get asked when I do a lot of training and consulting and working with worship teams across the country, and the number one question I get asked about diverse worship is, how can my church become more hospitable to, and then fill in the blank. We have a refugee population that's coming in. How can I become more hospitable to? We have, our church is moving into an area that's XYZ. How can we become more hospitable in our worship to fill in the blank? And I actually wanted to propose, and I propose in the book, that we have to ask questions beyond that, because while hospitality is important and we want to be communities that are inclusive, it actually is just a beginning space for why it's important to engage in diverse worship. And I'll say more about that in a minute. The number one disagreement I get when I go teaching across the country, people are like, I don't need to know about diverse worship or multi-ethnic worship because my congregation and my community are homogeneous. So therefore, I'm not trying to be hospitable to anyone, and I'm not trying to reach out to anyone of a different ethnic origin because they're just not there. So I don't really need to do this. So those two questions are actually linked together. Those 2 points are linked together. Number one, the number one question, how can I become more hospitable? And the number one disagreement, I don't need to be hospitable because my congregation or community is homogeneous. Both of those are rooted in the fact that typically when we talk about diversity in worship or preaching or any other kind of congregational practice, we're talking about hospitality. We're talking about including others. We're talking about reaching out to others. But we're not moving into what I propose in the book, The Next Worship, which is reconciliation and acknowledgement of the global church is not just about hospitality. It's about solidarity, which means that we don't only welcome people, but we stand with them. And it's about mutuality, which means we need them, and we learn from people who are different than us. So I would say, and I argue, that every single church body, whether it is African-American church in an urban setting, whether it's like my church, a primarily Latino church in an urban setting, whether it's a primarily Hmong church in rural Minnesota, every single church needs to engage in diverse worship as a way of standing in solidarity with the global church. It's a way of standing together with the church here in the U.S. as we think about all of our diverse experiences and expressions that we have here. The things that the African American community goes through, the things that folks that are coming in from different countries as refugees are going through, that we stand with them by acknowledging their struggle, their narrative, and their story. And then we learn from them as well. So being able to sing a hymn or a chorus from the church in the Middle East and allowing that chorus or hymn, whether it translated in English or sung in its original language, to penetrate the reality of our congregants, that the church is not just in our city. The church is not just the CRC or your denomination in North America. The church is global and is growing globally. And the center of the church is no longer here. The center of the church is actually located, it's polycentric. It's in 3 centers in the global south. And so we need to be with our brothers and sisters. We need to catch up with them. We need to be aligned with them. And we need to learn from them. What does it look like to be persecuted and still walk with Jesus? Well, we're going to learn that from the church in the Middle East and in parts of Northern Africa. What does it look like for church planting to happen and without any budget, because we don't know how to do that. We have to have big budgets to plant churches. We're going to learn that from Southeast Asia and from Latin America. What does sustainable spirituality look like when you're fighting issues of injustice? Or what does sustainable spirituality look like when you're mourning the loss of a loved one who's passing away or has a terminal illness? Well, there are entire countries where 50% of the male population are dying of HIV/AIDS. And the church is standing with the mothers and the children and the church is worshiping in the midst of that. And they can teach us what it looks like to have sustainable spirituality where we believe God is good when things are happening around us that tell us he isn't. So there's so much to learn from the global church. And if the only way we think about diverse worship is how can I get more XYZ young people in my church, then it's not really helping. It's not really deepening the discussion. There are 3 images that I like to use when I think about diverse worship. The first one is that of, I'm going to tell you what they are and I'll back up. The 3 images are ethnic food aisles, food trucks, I like food, and feasts. So the next worship, the book, the central image of the book, because I believe it's the central image of worship, is the table. So there's a lot of imagery around food and feasting. And so I want to start with ethnic food aisles. I want to first ask the question, what is ethnic food? Because when I go to the ethnic food aisles in my neighborhood, the things I find there are not Latino foods, because most of the grocery store is Latino food because that's who's living here. But when I used to live in the suburb of Chicago, I would go to the grocery store and there would be an aisle where there's ethnic food. And in the ethnic food aisle, you would find what? You would find Asian food, you would find taco shells, you would find kind of Spanish rices, you would find Thai sauces. Actually, you used to find spaghetti and things like that in the ethnic food aisle, but Italians graduated to being just American in the, like, I think it was in the 60s or 70s when our country became more and more suburban and people's ethnic identities were erased to become white Americans. We became kind of like, Italians were no longer ethnic. You don't find, I don't know, fruits and vegetables, bread. So it's like the whole store is regular food. And then just the ethnic food aisle is where Latinos shop. So the idea that it creates is the same in worship, is that all theology or all hymns or all liturgical practices are normal worship. And then we have African American worship, and then we have Latino choruses, and then we have African choruses and dancing, but the rest of it's regular worship. So it creates a false understanding of that there is normal culture and then there is ethnic culture, when in reality, every single one of our expressions is rooted in culture. The second image is food trucks, and I can talk more about that if you guys have questions. But the reason I love the image of the food truck is because if y'all have ever gone to these food truck like gatherings, you'll go to the food truck and it'll be like the most delicious Vietnamese pho noodles, but you realize the people that are making the noodles are not Vietnamese. It's probably someone who studied culinary arts and or like learned to make them from someone else, and he now owns a food truck, and so he's selling Vietnamese pho noodles, but he himself is not from that culture. So the imagery there I think best represents what it looks like to appropriate culture in worship, which means that you take something from someone's culture and you actually commodify it, make money off of it, or gain from it. And I think that people do that in worship. They take cultural expressions of worship from communities, they insert it into their worship. Like, we're having this big worship conference. Oh, we need to have an African American. Oh, let's have him come and do a rap. Okay, done. So that's not really including it. That's not really integrating it. That's not really learning from it. It's actually appropriating it for consumption. And I think food trucks best do that. Best symbolize that. I have rarely gone to a food truck that is owned by and operated by a person of that culture. If it's an Eastern food, or sometimes taco trucks, but not always actually. So I think it is a great image to talk about and to explore the issue of appropriation versus appreciation. Like, what does true inclusion look like? How do we move beyond tokenism to inclusion? And then the last one is, and we can expand on any of these, but the last image that often pops into my head when I think about diverse worship is the image that we have over and over again in the scriptures of this feast. This feast that we're going to have with the Lamb, this feast that we're going to have with one another, this feast that we are called to not, the scripture says not just snack on chips, but actually wait and long for this feast. Where people of every ethnicity and culture, of every background and language will come together and bring their distinct gifts to this feast. And it's not just about food. It's not that everyone's bringing, a dish from their community. It's that we're coming with our experiences. We're coming with our story. We're coming with our song that tells our story. And we're coming together around one God saying, you did all of this. You created all of this. You are Lord over all of this. Not just, again, that we eat together, but that we share life together. And when I think about congregations developing spaces of worship where people of every diverse culture can come, and or where we celebrate as a monocultural church the diversity of the global church, we are saying, we want that feast now. We want to have that experience at the table now. I don't just want to sing an African American spiritual. I want to know your story. I want to know, where does that song come from? And how can I stand with you today as a brother and sister in Christ? So the image of the feast is the one that guides me. And it's the one that compels me to continue to plead to my own church, as well as the churches that I work with, that we expand our vision of the kingdom to what is in Scripture, and that we practice today as an expression and a pointer to what is going to be.
All right, thanks, Sandra. I have to apologize to all of those who joined us, and I believe that we didn't let you join until a few minutes into the presentation, Sandra. So
sorry.
No, it was my fault. I think there was a button that said the meeting is not live, and I didn't understand that. No, you can keep your camera on. Please keep your camera on, Sandra. That's good, because we're going to do the Q&A now, and we'll move right into that. But let me just repeat for those online that we are recording this session. So if you want to watch and listen to those first couple of minutes, which was mostly just my introduction of Sandra Van Opstal, that you'll be able to do that, to see that on the recording. And also at the very end, I will put up a slide that, again, lists the books that Sandra has written, and things like that. So if you would like to ask questions of Sandra, this is a good time to do it, of any questions that you have about how to do this in your setting or what might apply to you. Go ahead and type them either in the chat. I see we have a question or two in the chat box, or in the Q&A, which is shows up at the bottom of your the box here, the screen. So feel free to do that. And Sandra, if you can put your video on.
Yeah, Diane, I'm so sorry. I didn't know I shouldn't stop it, and I did. And now when I click on it, it says you can't start your video because the host has stopped it.
Oh, okay.
So is there a way for you to start it again? If not, they can just hear my voice. I'm fine with that.
Right, okay. We were having this problem earlier, and I'm not sure. Maybe Laura can check again how to get us back into that. But let me ask the first question for you, and then you can start to answer this while we work on the video.
Sorry about that. That was my bad.
No, that's okay. You're good. So Eric has asked the question, how would you recommend helping our multi-ethnic but white majority, potentially 80% white, mostly Dutch African or Dutch American ethnic church, move towards understanding the need to abandon the expectation that worship stops after 90 minutes? We pride ourselves in not having a 60-minute service, but I think we now have a 90-minute worship expectation. So this is the time thing here. I'm finding that more of our African American members and those from the more charismatic tradition are feeling that getting out on time as a value is quenching the Holy Spirit. So how do you address that?
Wow, yeah. So, I have a, I have to say, I have a 2 hour expectation, Eric. So, um, like this Sunday when, and my church knows I'm very upfront with them, but like this Sunday when the service kept going, I was like, oh no, because I have a toddler who's 3, right? So I'm like, oh no, my toddler. And, oh, here we go.
Yeah, there you are.
And,
I got it. She's on.
So I'm like thinking my toddler, and we didn't have nursery that day. We just happened to not have nursery, like because there's certain days we don't have it. So I'm in there with my toddler thinking, oh my gosh, this is going to be, and I'm the pastor, so I have to do, like, I'm up there like with the anointing oil praying for people, and I'm thinking about like, and then of course I'm concerned for the people that come from backgrounds, because we do have some relocators that are coming from. I'm not as concerned with the Korean relocators because they're used to, like, if it's prayer, like they'll go for 4 hours, so but I'm more concerned with, like, okay, there's some visitors here, there's some people that come from more like time-oriented cultures. My husband is super time-oriented, so but he also has a gift in intercession. So I was like, I'm navigating all that in my head. So I understand the pastoral concern, because I teach on this stuff and I'm going through it myself. Like, am I just being judgy? Should I just like calm down? Maybe people aren't that upset, and so I think the thing your question brings up is that expectations are the issue. That we develop expectations that are cultural, right? Whatever that expectation is. Like, we have an expectation, some of our churches, that we're going to have a prayer ministry every single Sunday. And if we don't have it, then the Holy Spirit didn't show up. And like, I'm preaching this Sunday and I hope there's time for prayer, but I don't know. I'm not in my like sermon prep enough to know or expect whether or not I plan on doing a prayer ministry time or a call to commitment, or it's just going to be like a time of worship after. I don't know yet. So, but it makes me to be honest with you, it makes me a little nervous, because I feel like if the expectation from some congregants is that if we don't have a prayer ministry time, the Holy Spirit really didn't show up, or it wasn't really powerful, or, and I'm like, I understand why that's there, because let me explain exactly. I understand why that's there because in Latino charismatic traditions, whether they're reformed theologically or other theologically, there's an expectation that God's going to show up in the service. Like, the reason for worship is not instruction. The reason for the worship gathering is encounter. So I think this is true of African American traditions that are more charismatic as well. Like, people don't come to church to be instructed in scripture. They come to church to encounter God. They come to church because something has happened that week, and they need to encounter a living God and know that he's going to show up in their lives and do something about XYZ. So when you're in those kinds of situations, I think this is true of the global church as well, in many countries and experiences, that the reason for gathering is actually different. Like, the essence of what worship is about is different. So where style could be different and form could be different, I actually think essence sometimes is different. And I know we like to think it's the same, but it's actually not. We want to be with community. We want to love God. That's the basic, and tell God that we love him. But many of our churches we go to church for instruction. We go to like learn something about God so that we can, like, I don't know, self-actualize, or we go because we always have, because this is what our family does. Someone told me the other day, like, we've been going to this camp for 70 years. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's like a lot of tradition. Like, I don't think my family's done anything for 70 years because we're immigrants. So we're constantly moving and changing and evolving, and every generation's culture is different than the last one. And so I don't even know a life or a world where you do something for 70 years, So I think that it's hard, Eric, because we're operating with completely different reasons we're coming to church. And so it's not about, did they sing a song that Kirk Franklin or, Tasha Cobbs or, these newer guys, it's not about did we sing their song or was there diversity or colors up front. It's I'm coming to church because I need to encounter God. And the other person sitting next to you is like, I'm coming to church to learn something about God. And both of them are appropriate and good. But then when the person has learned something about God, they're like, okay, I'm done. And they're not expecting to encounter God the way the person next to them is. And now they're like, okay, we're over time. Why are we doing this? So I know I explained why it happens and I didn't give a solution, but I want to say, yes, it's that hard. It is that hard. And some of the things I think you can do is if there are particular people in the culture, like in our context, it's minority white. So I would probably just have conversations with them about how they're experiencing church and what could be done differently. I do think though some churches that are multi-ethnic and have more of a Western time orientation, they actually have different spaces for their more charismatic people of color in their church where they do worship differently in those spaces. I know Korean churches do the same thing where their morning prayer meetings tend to be more extemporaneous and longer and free flowing, But I think the difficulty is hard because, it's difficult because we are thinking at the level of style and expression, and they're thinking way deeply at the level of like, why are we here together? And why would time matter? So I would say in a church, I would need to know the specifics of the church, but I would say, are there places where you can have that style of worship or that experience of worship that isn't on a Sunday morning? And then are there ways that you can, if the worship leader or the pastor feel led to create that type of experience on a Sunday morning, where you can give permission to people that don't want to be in that to go ahead and slip out, like there's nothing wrong with that. Or can you encourage them and coach them to be present even if they're not necessarily experiencing the encounter. So for example, this Sunday, we were there for 45 minutes and there were so many people up front. I didn't know what to do. I just started calling every leader and elder that I felt could exercise some prayer authority because we were there for so long. And then every once in a while you have to let the rest of the congregation know, if for you, you're not receiving prayer or you're not necessarily having to reflect on XYZ, whatever it was we were praying for, then we're asking you not to disengage, but to actually intercede for your brothers and sisters that are up here. You're in their small groups. You live near them. You know their stories. You've walked with them. So instead of disengaging, be present and continue to pray for as many of the people up here as you know from your seat. And then that helps people understand that church is not just about them. It's actually about all of us. And so I think there's things the worship pastor or lead pastor can do to coach and interpret for the congregation what's happening. And I think there's also other spaces we can provide for people that kind of meets that need. And I think that it's just really that hard.
All right. Yes, I think so too. And the next question is from Tim, and I will read it so that everybody at least can hear it. I've wrestled with for some time with this question. If music is an emotional form of communication and is culturally conditioned, how do I ask people to be emotionally engaged in worship when the form of emotional communication is foreign to them? I tend to think this is one of the primary reasons that Sunday morning is segregated. I see the problem but don't have a solution. I see churches typically responding in 3 ways. Do a blended form of worship style, or 2, do multiple services, each with a different style, or 3, choose one style and assume only people who prefer that style will attend your church. None of these seem like a satisfying solution. So do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, the first part of it, I agree with. I think, it's interesting when you're married cross-culturally and also across just personality. Like my husband, I wish he could be here with me because we love to talk about this stuff together, but he is the opposite Myers-Briggs, the opposite Enneagram as me, like the opposite. He comes from a wealthy, white, educated family. We just have very different experiences. He grew up with like a real desire to understand and kind of discuss and debate theology. I don't have that. I'm more of a like, what does it matter? Like to the real world, like tell me how that impacts my real life. So we're just wired very differently, and that makes it exciting. So a lot of times in church, in church services, different church services, we talk about like, is the person up front, for example, if we're in a Black church on the West Side, is the person up front trying to get us to like emote? Is that the goal of this? Or are they trying to get us to engage? So I want to say, I think there's a difference between emoting and engaging. And I think about this for myself, if I'm the type of person that is very demonstrative when I talk to anyone on the bus, and when I pray, I'm not that way, I actually would ask myself why. Like, if I, as a natural expression of like who God made me, if I am demonstrative, but then when I go to pray, I'm not demonstrative, it's not that demonstrative prayer or loud prayer is better prayer. But the question is, why don't I pray that way then? Because that's how I talk to my mom. That's how I talk to my husband. That's how I talk to my children. That's how I preach from the stage or from the pulpit if I'm in the local church. So why don't I talk like that to God? And I had to actually ask myself that 2 weeks ago because I was visiting a church and my husband had a headache when we left. And he said, I don't understand. And he's more quiet. He's like, he's extroverted, but he's just like more chill, So I said, actually, I understand it for you because you never raise your voice. Like you're very chill, you're very, so I could see why, like when you pray, you're engaged in that way. But for me, actually, I think I've been taught and formed to pray in a way that is not natural to who I am because of the Christian communities that form me in prayer. So therefore, on a Sunday morning, when I'm in this church visiting, because I'm like, well, I don't know. I don't just want to be emotional to be emotional. But in actuality, I'm not really engaged. And I have to admit that to myself. I'm not engaged in prayer. So why is that? And it's because I haven't been taught to engage that way. So I just want to stop on that first part first and say, I actually think it's weird that Christians that are extremely demonstrative in the way they speak socially do not talk to God that way. I think it's strange. And I think it's strange that Christians that cheer at concerts and at football gatherings and at their children's recitals, and when they want to say like good job, they're like, woo, like that they don't express themselves that way to God. I think that's a culturally formed way of being that it's not bad. I think we need to ask some questions. That's why I think we need to ask some questions. Because we would never say to someone at a children's recital, your volume and your joy for your child is really distracting me from watching. No, you'd be like, oh, their parents excited. I'm excited. I'm going to scream louder than them. I'm going to scream louder than that they did. So in the same way, I wonder what caused that in our church. I don't know what it is, but I think somebody should probably do some research on that. I'm processing this myself, Tim, because I think I don't know why I was taught to pray the way that I was or worship the way that I was. But I know that it doesn't match my natural self outside of a church. In some aspects, it doesn't match my natural self outside of a church setting. I think I've been able to change. I think I've been freed in my preaching style. I think I've been freed in my leadership and congregational worship, but I don't think in prayer I don't think I know how to engage. I don't think I do. And I'm learning from my congregation, and I'm very thankful for them. So I think watching them be free with their longings, like they're longing for healing in their marriage, they're longing for physical healing for their family members, they're longing for meaning in life. I think the way they're able to come before God reminds me of the stories in scripture that we like to preach about, where the woman would throw herself at Jesus' feet or grab his cloak, or kind of become undone in front of the Lord. And I don't think there's a right or wrong way of being. I just think we need to ask more questions about why we do what we do. I look at my husband during worship, and he's super engaged, but he expresses himself very differently than I do. It's congruent with his personality, the way he worships. My prayer style and my prayers are not congruent with my personality right now. So I think I'm trying to figure out why. As far as responding, I think we should do something, but I think we should find out why first. I think part of it is being able to teach people. I like to keep the whole congregation together when I can, because I feel like we learn from one another. I don't think different services are bad. I don't think there's anything categorically wrong with them, but the implications of splitting people up is that they stop learning from one another. They don't, like when I call my congregation, or once I was leading worship for a camp week up in Michigan in the school, was a lot of there's actually a lot of Korean and African American students from Michigan schools. And I remember I was doing a day that was more liturgical and more contemplative. And I shared with them why this tradition is important, and why it's important for those of us that constantly feel like we need to be talking during prayer. And so I kind of led them into that experience. And afterwards, many of them came up to me and said, I used to think that was like, that kind of worship is like, for people that are spiritually dead, because they don't have any kind of expression, or kind of, it didn't look the way their worship looks. And they said, now I understand that it's just about being before God sometimes, and not always talking to him, but just kind of like when you love someone and you don't have anything to say, and you've had a hard day, you just sit down next to them, and you just kind of sit in their presence. And I said, yeah, that's what it's like. So I think that we rob one another the opportunity to learn from one another when we segregate our worship experiences. So I think trying to blend them could be, but I don't think that a blended, you can read this in my book, because I talk about different styles, different ways to approach diverse worship. But I think what I think most of the blended services I see kind of like the lowest common denominator of every beautiful thing. So it's like you take a bunch of colors together and you mix them, and it becomes brown, like a beige brown. So I think to do it well, it's hard to do it well that really preserves the intent of the expression. So for example, doing a liturgical like a call, a reading, a prayer, like I don't know what to call it. My mind is somewhere else. Like a prayer where the congregation says something, and you say, like a led prayer like that, and doing some forms of silence and reflection and confession and written prayers of assurance, that kind of stuff. I think if you don't leave enough space to do those components together, you actually rob the beauty of that experience, because you just kind of like, now let's do this written prayer, and now let's like jump up and down and clap our hands, and now let's, so I think it's just, it takes a lot of finesse and nuance to create a blended form of worship that doesn't kind of leave everything lacking. But it can be done. I would say that what I prefer, and it's not the right way or the wrong way, what I prefer is to actually give the service to the component. Like if you're going to give the service to celebrate, like a celebration of experiencing God and encountering God in celebration and in worship and in freedom, then give the whole service to that and form it around that. And then the next time you could, do something else. But I think blending different things, it takes a lot of work. And I think that's why you should work together with people from within those cultures if they're represented in your church.
All right, great. We have another question from Eric that we'd like to get to here. I have a second question. This is from Eric. I'm a white guy, but as an older teen, I was mentored by several African-American worship leaders in a multi-ethnic church. Now I've been hired as a worship director at a multi-ethnic church plant. I often wrestle with looking like a food truck by people who don't know my backstory. I'm in the process of empowering non-white worship leaders in the church, but we are so new, and many of our people of color members, POC members, are not strong singers yet. We want to have a multi-ethnic group empowered worship team who owns the worship planning. But at the end of the day, it ends up being my job, Eric's job, if people can't do it or don't show up on Sunday. So you see his dilemma. Any pointers on how to go from where we are to where we want to go? And I don't like the way I express myself here with I'm empowering people, but I'm trying to type and listen at the same time.
Yeah,
understandable.
I hear what you're saying, Eric, because
Yeah.
we don't give people power. We don't empower people. We create environments where people can be empowered, or can tap into the way God created them. So I hear that, but I know you, so I know what you mean by that. I know you're creating an environment. Let me go back to the food truck thing since you brought it up, and I'll say some things. A friend of mine who I lead worship with, she's a Chinese American woman in San Diego. She's fantastic. She's a great musician. She's got a real gift in creating spaces of prayer and deliverance in worship, and she's fantastic. So we worked together on when I led Urbana 09, and then we worked together again when I led Urbana 12, and then she wrote a blog actually about this experience. I think that I think really communicates it. I think the reference is in the book, but the blog is called 3D Worship. I think that's what she called it. And she basically talks about how, like, when she first started doing diverse worship on her campus, and when we did Urbana 09, she felt like it was about like collecting songs, learning different styles, learning how to utilize your voice differently, play achieve instrumentation and then she realized that the songs that we were selecting, and in particular the songs I was selecting, had to do with communities I was connected to. And she was right. So she didn't talk to me about it. She just blogged about it. And I said, okay, so she's observing what's happening. She said, we're not picking songs for Urbana 12 that are like, oh, cool, that was a really cool song that Israel Houghton redid on his, album when he was in Indonesia or South Africa. We were choosing songs that were gifted to us by people whose stories we knew, and by people whose current struggles we were connected to. So I think that's what I mean about food trucks. Someone who owns a food truck where they're selling pad thai, for $12, who isn't connected to the Thai community, who isn't engaging, who doesn't understand the Thai history, who doesn't engage in the current struggles of the Thai community or the Southeast Asian community in our country, is just taking their property. A designer that is taking Native American looking clothes and patterns and putting them on t-shirts and blouses and selling them at Target and making money out of it without, number one, donating all the proceeds to Native Americans who've already had everything taken from them. Number two, understanding the Native American struggle or telling some kind of story through that is basically just appropriating and just equally, like, doubly offensive because we've already taken so much. So it's like we're further appropriating and further taking and further raping their culture. But if you are a person that is connected to, for example, I have a connection to and a relationship with people in the community of Mokattam in Egypt, and I am trying to communicate their struggle and communicate their spirituality and share the gift of perseverance that comes from that church, and with my terrible Arabic, try to share the songs that I've learned from them, and include their story, that is a very different experience. So I think for you, Eric, like, because I know you're married cross-culturally, because I know you've had mentors in this community, it's not that it can't happen, but it's less likely that you're just taking things from African American traditions and trying to mimic them. It seems like you're trying to share and help your congregation engage in the beauty that is the African American tradition and what we have to learn from it, as you know, in our understanding of sustainable spirituality and our understanding of walking in perseverance and struggle, in our own ways. And yeah, and as far as not having other singers, you know, I mean, you consult with people. I do that all the time. I send out an email, hey guys, we're doing a series on the Holy Spirit. And I send it out to 25 of my closest worship leading friends who are of different cultures and lead in different contexts. Could you tell me what songs on the Holy Spirit you sing in your tradition? So I'm actually curating music from a worship community across the country and across the world. And then I'm asking them about the song. Tell me why you guys sing that song. And how, when you sing it, like, do I just go through, like, is it a 5-minute song? No, it usually lasts 15 minutes. Okay. So what do I do with a song? Like, what is it that you're doing with the song that'll last 15 minutes, you know? And that's why oftentimes I'll take short videos of worship times at our church or at churches that I go to, because sometimes things are easier experienced than explained. It's like, here's the same song from, you know, from whoever, Chris Tomlin, but I mean, it lasted 18 minutes. And did you see what the worship leader did with the song? Versus like, oh, we executed that song. So I think that you can have probably a group of people, a community of people that you learn from. That's one of the things I actually want to do with students. I work with InterVarsity a lot, and there's young staff and students, our worship leaders, who they don't have formal avenues of training. So they're like, how am I supposed to do multi-ethnic worship if no one's training me? It's like guessing all the time. So I really would love to start cohorts of worship leaders, because we have these for preachers, out of things like the Micah groups, where there's a cohort of a diverse set of worship leaders that is studying together, learning together, and also like they can share their material. Like, I share my sermon with someone and say, what do you think of this? And so they can say, I'm leading at a conference at a camp this week for students. Here's the worship set I have. Like, what do you think of this? And my first question is going to be, did you design this yourself, or did other people design this with you? And are you just going to tell the Latina that she's going to sing Te Alabaré, or are you going to actually let her pick her own song? You know, so that's where the hard questions get asked. So I wonder if some folks just need to develop their own little cohorts of worship leaders, where they can say, every time I do a series, or every time I'm putting a song package together for the year for my team, I'm going to like run this by other people so that I get some other eyes on it, because I don't have that locally. So.
All right, great. It is 12 o'clock, or just about 12 o'clock, but we have another question, so we're going to go a few minutes over. And if people need to leave, they could come back and watch the recording. Just to also mention that you will, if you're attending, you will get an email that gives you the link for the recording in probably about a week or so when we get it posted on our website. But Sandra, are you able to stay for a few more minutes and answer another question? Okay.
Yeah.
This is the follow-up from Tim, too. With a bit of clarification.
Okay.
Yeah, we sing songs because they are emotional tools. We don't speak songs, we sing them, but stylistically, each person responds differently to various styles of music. So if we sing a 17th century hymn in 4-part harmony, the Kenyan in my church, or the 17-year-old white American for that matter, will probably not sing that song with any emotional connection. Is that okay?
Okay, Tim. The other day we sang a song at church, and you guys have learned a little bit about my church as I've been talking. So the other day we sang a song, well, not the other day, for Good Friday. For the whole weekend we picked some songs, and we did a song that someone in my church who leads in the area of worship had said way when I first started pastoring there 5 years ago, we will never sing that song because it just doesn't fit the style of our church. And we're not trying to be a multi-ethnic church. We're trying to be a church for the community. Therefore, we're going to do songs. We're going to create worship that appeals, kind of to to the expression and the culture of its context, which makes sense in some ways. But I, of course, am saying, no, everyone should engage in diverse worship because we learned something from 17th century hymns in 4-part harmony, And so the woman began to sing. It's so interesting. We didn't do it in 4-part harmony, but the woman who was leading that particular song and moment began to, and she's actually from the area where the CRC is located, the denomination in the US at least. And she grew up there, and she's she's connected to that tradition. So it's her heart, it's her song, So she starts singing it. I'm not kidding you. Everyone in the church raised their hands up in the air and started just singing the song. And I thought it was so funny because I, of course, was like, well, I was like, oh no, we're going to do this song. We're going to get in trouble because we're going to do the song, people are not going to like it. And in reality, it came from such an authentic place for her. And the words of the song were so beautiful, and the melody of the song, because it fits all of it was so beautiful. And all of these people that aren't from this background really connected with it. And I have to say, in this case, in the case of this particular song in my church, they're just worshipers. I just start like hitting a stick against the music stand, they'll probably just start breaking down worship. But so I think it has more to do with the heart of the community. But I don't want us to think yes, you're right, Tim. There are certain things that when I hear certain rhythms on the radio, like there's a Spanish song right now that's real popular. It's on every English speaking popular radio station. The words are terrible. Like it's, some love song, whatever. But when I hear the rhythm of that song, there's something that happens inside of me. It's like, I just connect to it. There's something in me that literally connects to the rhythm of the song. And it's because it's the rhythm that I've heard from the womb. So therefore, I'm connected in some way. In the same way, there are some things that happen in our bodies because we are physical beings. When we hear a language or experience a rhythm or are in a prayer space that just is saturated in a way that we understand, with God's presence, that changes us. And so, yes, that is true. But I believe that people can be stretched. I believe that people do want to learn if they understand why they're doing it and if it's done well. So I think it puts a lot of responsibility on us, not to like be fantastic musicians, but to be good pastors, to be good interpreters, to be good guides to people. Like for example, if we're going to do this for, I don't know what hymn it is, but like, I'm going to tell my congregation, we're going to sing a song that comes from a tradition that's not, familiar to us, but XYZ. Or the next song we're going to sing talks about the centrality of Christ and the power of Christ. And so I'm going to speak to the issues of my congregation. For many of you, I know that we need to experience God's power and deliverance in these areas. So as we sing this hymn, invite God to speak to you there. So the introduction is different because my congregation is different. I think there are ways that we can, and I tried it in the book, in the chapter on leadership. I think it's like Master Chefs or something. It's like about developing leaders is the last chapter. And then in one of the appendixes that are about like worship cultures, it's Appendix I think. Both of those places in the book address like, how does a leader do that? Yes, I would still do the 7-10%. I wouldn't do it maybe every week, but once a quarter, I'm going to throw it out there.
That was good. I think it gets, as we've been talking, it's gotten closer to the heart of the matter. And I just really appreciated that last question and answer too. All of them have been really good, but You know, you're not saying that we have to do it, sing the Arabic song perfectly, but you're saying you have to do it pastorally, right? You have to get deeper. You have to get to the heart, and as a pastor, you know, lead the people.
Yeah, and can I just add one quick thing? Sorry,
Mhm.
I just looked at the bottom of your question, Tim. I think anyone who's married or is a parent understands this. Sometimes you do things that you have no emotional connection to because you love the person, or because you know it will develop feelings. So my husband and I just had this not argument but discussion, because he was like, well, sometimes we just have to do things like go on dates to like develop connection, not just like wait till you feel connected, you know, because we both travel a lot, so we're talking about how connected we feel. So I think that's part of the journey, is also correcting people's understanding that we do sing songs because they're emotional tools. We do, but we also practice worship because it is fitting and right that we glorify God. So there are many times I know that you all as worship leaders go into your church on Sunday and preach or lead worship, and you're like, I'm not feeling this today. But you still give God glory, and you still tell him how good he is, and you still ask people to do so. And so I think that if someone sings a song, even if they are not emotionally connected to it, maybe they could understand it and be intellectually connected to it. Maybe they can, I always tell people, like, usually diverse worship starts with observation. They're kind of like watching it happen. And then they're like, okay, this is not that bad. Let me participate. And then about 2 years later, they're actually worshiping, you know, like they're actually like emotionally connected to it and free. But it doesn't make the initial part any less authentic. So I think that's the same with our marriages. We get married and we think like we have all the love we need in the first year, and then you realize, oh, trust is built, love is built, connection is built. So I think in the same way, if we could teach our congregations that worship is, while we do want to be emotionally connected, I don't know, I wrote this in the book. This one guy once was like, well, I just don't like singing in Spanish. I don't feel like I connect to it. You know, like it's not me, you know, and I don't feel like I connect. I'm like, oh, is worship about you and your connection primarily then? That's a problem. So I do think there needs to be balance. We want to be connected. We want people to be emotionally in line. There are things we can do to help people find those spaces. But I also think it's just okay if people observe for a couple months until they're able to actually engage. That's natural.
All right, great. Thank you. And we've come to the end of our time and the end of our questions. So we want to thank you, Sandra, especially for sharing your wisdom and your stories and all of that with us. And if people haven't read the book, I hope they get it. It's easy to find on Amazon, The Next Worship, Glorifying God in a Diverse World. And yeah, we just want to thank everybody for joining. I will share my screen again so that we can get to the last screen here, which is, I don't know if that's going to share or not, maybe not. It's just a thank you and shows your book. So I guess we'll get back to that again. All right, so thanks everybody for coming, and I will say goodbye, and hopefully you can join us next week for the webinar that we're going to be doing on Wednesday again. Thanks and have a great day, everybody. Goodbye.